Hello everyone, Lore Master of Sotek here, and I think it goes without saying that everyone in the Total War Warhammer community has their thoughts and dreams currently haunted by the children of Hashut. The shadows cast by the toxic clouds produced by Tsar Nagrand are easy to feel upon us all, as the steady thrum of excitement continues to build with each passing day that we grow closer to Q2 of this year. The hype demon train has left the station, and it's time to really dive into the potential of what lies beyond the horizon. So let's take today to discuss the potential roster that we might see for the Chaos Dwarfs. Now, starting with the potential legendary lords, there are 6 characters that really leap out at me as viable options, with some more likely than others. We'll start with the guaranteed characters and work our way down. Starting with the ultimate big boss of the Dawi Tsar himself, we have Astragoth Ironhand. You can learn lots of details about him and literally everything mentioned in this video over in the Chaos Dwarf Q&A series, so for the sake of keeping things to the point, I'll mainly be summarizing with a focus on how I expect them to potentially function in Total War, and if you want all the nitty-gritty details, all those episodes in the Q&A are well labeled and you go find stuff there. Back to Astragoth, he is the High Priest of Hashut, and has been terrorizing the Darklands for well over 1,000 years. As the oldest living Chaos Dwarf sorcerer, he wields a considerable amount of power and authority, though it is noted that his sorceress abilities have begun to wane. Much of his body has petrified, most notably his legs have completely ceased to function, and even his hands have turned to stone. To compensate for this, Astragoth constructed a mechanical device that allows him to move around and tear apart his foes. With this in mind, the best way I imagine representing Astragoth, I think, would be as a powerhouse melee character who has access to reasonable magic, but isn't the absolute strongest caster in the roster. For instance, perhaps he only has regular Arcane Conduit instead of greater Arcane Conduit, or he has a not as great selection of spells compared to the other wizards. However, he should be immensely tough, swift, and strong. In his tabletop profile, he was actually alarmingly fast for a dwarf by having double their movement speed, which made him around as fast as most large creatures like monsters or monstrous infantry. So imagine a dwarf that's moving practically the same speed as a stegodon. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Then, between his mechanical parts and his stone flesh, he should just be insanely tanky. I am admittedly curious if Creative Assembly will use his original 5th edition model design, which has his mecha suit, so to speak, as essentially limb extenders, or if they'll base it more on the suit we see in the Wulfric Black Library novel, which has a sorcerer prophet using a far more heavy-duty design, reminiscent of something like a Space Marine dreadnought. In any event, I suspect he'll start in Tsar Nagrand itself and should be the functional faction leader, so to speak, for the Chaos Dwarfs. And do let me know down in the comment section, are you hoping to see his original design, kind of the more nostalgic, and see how they could make that intimidating and work well? Or are you hoping for a more modern design that has him much more heavy and kind of like Iron Hulk-ish? Next up is the other, in my opinion, guaranteed legendary lord, which is of course the terrifying Drazhoath the Ashen, Lord of the Black Fortress. This terrifying sorcerer prophet is one of the most powerful wizards to be found among the Chaos Dwarfs, and comes packed with a mighty Bale Taurus to sweeten the deal. Drazhoath should definitely be the super wizard of the pack, bringing the lore of Hashut out to full power. However, if Astragoth also has the lore of Hashut, then perhaps Drazhoath could have a mixed lore to represent him as the stronger of the two, because often the strongest wizards in Total War tend to have mixed lores. Perhaps in that event, he could have some mix of the lores of Hashut, fire, and death, maybe? Astragoth should be a fairly strong melee combatant himself, but considerably less tough than most of the other options, as he should focus mostly on aggression. Of course, he is the main monstrous character, as he has the mount Cinder Breath, an immense Bale Taurus with the flaming fury to match dragons. While not as well armored as a dragon, they do have the blazing body rule, which, if you translate the tabletop directly into Total War, would essentially grant them melee damage reflection and physical resistance. So it makes you more resistant to most forms of damage as long as it's like of the appropriate type, and it would bounce damage back. Between the spells and Raging Bull, Drazoath should be the absolute darling of anyone who just wants to unleash utter destruction with the Chaos Dwarfs. His campaign will most likely start in the Black Fortress, which is found in the southeastern Darklands. Now we move on to the maybes of the Legendary Lord list. The most likely candidate among this crowd to make it into the game is Zatan the Black, commander of the Tower of Zar. Zatan is the most infamous of the Chaos Dwarf generals, an extremely tanky character who should specialize in maybe more of a support role. Just an incredibly difficult to shift fighter that hits relatively hard and provides powerful bonuses to nearby units to really bring out the best of their abilities. In his 5th edition entry, Zatan was able to take a Lamassu or Great Taurus as a mount option. He also will likely be the best legendary lord at gathering slaves, as Zatan is most famous for being a prolific raider to capture fresh stock for his sorcerer prophet master. For starting position, Zatan could really go anywhere. Perhaps he's in Mount Grimfang, which he's famous for raiding in the Western Darklands, or further afield, leading the naval fleets to the High Elf Isles found southeast of the Southlands. Could be a good mix. I do really hope, though, they give Zatan some abilities to really hurt enemy leadership, or perhaps really buff allied leadership, as he is a terrifyingly cruel character. Zatan was noted that even among the Chaos Dwarves, he made his kin rather uncomfortable due to how much he enjoyed and indulged in the suffering of others, which is pretty impressive as far as Chaos Dwarfs go. Next up is Zatan's Master, who I honestly think is the least likely character I'll be discussing to make it into the game. Back in 5th edition, Gorth the Cruel was said to be the most powerful of the living Chaos Dwarf sorcerers, though personally I think this position has since been supplanted by Drazoath the Ashen. In any event, were he to be used, he would be the 3rd Sorcerer Prophet Legendary Lord and would struggle to really differentiate himself in any way from Drazoath. Perhaps he could specialize in abilities that debuff the hell out of enemies, as his cruelty is said to have no limits, and he is very inventive in the way he tortures and rips souls out of people. He would be able to ride a Lamassu, Great Taurus, or Bale Taurus into battle, and come with notably powerful magical skills. I think he'd be a terrible choice, to be frank, but he does bear considering. For a start position, I would think he'd suit the Tower of Gorgoth well, or perhaps the Southern Elven Isles in Zatan's stead. Though, like I said, I'd personally rather have Zatan than Gorth, just because that's too many Sorcerer Prophets in my opinion. Looking to a much chunkier lad, a character I dearly hope for is Shartor the Executioner. Shartor is a Bull Centaur character that sadly missed the boat on Warhammer Fantasy by just a bit, and found himself released by Forge World during the early days of Age of Sigmar. However, he was released completely alone to join alongside the already existing Tarmacon range, which leads me to strongly believe that he was intended for fantasy, similar to the Giant River Trollhag and Squig Gaba, who were also released relatively late. With the Giant River Trollhag in the game, it gives potential that Shartor will be classified as a fantasy character and shall come charging in as the 4th Legendary Lord. Shartor, as the most elite of the Bull Centaurs, should be an absolute beefcake designed to tear apart foes in combat. For some reason, I envision him with anti-large to go alongside his heavy armor piercing, so he can duel against other monstrous foes and properly thrash them. For a start position, I think he'd suit the dread city of Uskalar particularly well, as it is the holy origin site of where the Chaos Dwarfs first encountered Hashut, and would allow him easy access to rampage into the Chaos Wastes, World's Edge Mountains, or Kislev. As for the lore about him, there really isn't any. Like I said, Shartor just kind of popped out one day in Forge World, and he's been discontinued since. So he was kind of almost like a limited release that was a very bizarre, isolated model, though it is a gorgeous sculpt. And like I said, I would love to see him join the roster and finally get fleshed out, other than he's just a a really important servant of Hashut and the biggest, baddest of the Bull Centaurs, but that's really it. Finally, there's the little bastard himself, Gorduz Backstabber. If the name didn't give it away, Gorduz is the only hobgoblin character among the Chaos Dwarfs. He's a spiteful creature who has managed to successfully elevate himself to the rank of Khan among the hobgoblin slaves without drawing the ire of his masters. While not a true Khan of the Eastern Steppes, this pretender is still the longest surviving chieftain in the Darklands tribes, which speaks to his terrible cunning, immense luck, or likely some mix of the two. I will admit, I struggle a bit to see him as a legendary lord, as a hobgoblin leading Chaos Dwarf troops should frankly be impossible, but perhaps that could be navigated around by giving him some severe penalties to recruit Chaos Dwarf units. Or maybe he could be like Skarsnik and be completely unable to recruit Chaos Dwarfs until after he's conquered Zarnagrund and turned the situation in his favor. Alternatively, he would make a lovely legendary hero, and I do love me some quality legendary heroes. As for the character himself, Gorduz has the option to ride a giant wolf like most hobgoblins, and should come with all sorts of nasty abilities to specialize in assassinating other characters. Poisoned attacks, solid armor-piercing damage, character debuff active abilities, perhaps a net ability of some sort with, tricksy traps or whatever. He should also grant massive buffs to hobgoblins in his army, as he would know how to make the most of those treacherous lads. If he were a lord, I would have his start position be in the Chaos Waste northeast of the Darklands, near the Great Bastion of Kislev. So perhaps somewhere between Kolek Suneater and Village, the Curseling? Gorduz is definitely one of those characters where I wouldn't mind seeing him, because I would like for there to be at least one hobgoblin character in the game, but at the same time, I would also like to see the Hobgoblin Khanate be a playable faction, and if we were going to do that, then I don't think Gorduz should be a legendary lord, because the focus should be on like the actual hobgoblin race with their own like units and cultures and stuff, as opposed to, just a propped up slave of the servant hobgoblins. In any event, that is all the named characters out of the way. Please be sure to let me know which of the 4 that you would want to have in the game down below. I mean, I have an obvious bias, but you may learn little things about the characters going into the Q&A, or just by looking them up, or knowledge you already have, and say, oh, no, I think we should go with this person or this person. Let me know. In any event, let's dive into the much simpler part of the video, where we could just very briefly go over what I think could potentially be in the Dawizar roster. I want to note that I am not expecting all of the things I'm about to talk about to appear. I'm literally just throwing anything Chaos Dwarf shaped at the wall and seeing what sticks. So the most important figure within Chaos Dwarf society is, of course, the sorcerer prophets of Hashut, who interpret the will of their cruel god and constantly squabble within the towers of Zarnagrund. These powerful wizards should have access to the lores of fire, metal, death, and of course, Hashut. For mounts, they can choose from the Lamassu, Great Taurus, and Bale Taurus, which we'll speak about those specifically later on. As for their overall design, they should be much tankier than the wizards of other factions and have unique access to ranged weapons in the form of naphtha bombs or pistols. Naphtha bombs are essentially grenades, so I think giving them the pistol would allow for a very unique wizard that's difficult to kill, but still has a okay shooting attack. I wouldn't make it as accurate or strong as, say, the Vampire Coast pistols, but I really like characters that just have like little shooty weapons that aren't just purely dedicated shooting characters. I don't know, it just adds a different dynamic. Obviously, their offensive abilities in combat and speed should both be relatively low, but hey, that's what the monstrous mounts are for. The only other lord option that should be available to the children of Hashut is the Chaos Dwarf Lord, though I hope a more original name is given to this bugger. Perhaps they could use a unit champion title for him, like Slaver or Death Mask. Anyway, these cruel taskmasters are servants of the sorcerer prophets, but wield considerable power and influence within Zarnagrund, often leading armies out to deal with threats or to raid foreign lands for slaves or riches. These buggers should be proper melee-focused lords, who rely on extremely high stats at the cost of typical dwarf speed and a little armor-piercing damage due to the single weapon/shield combo. I imagine them to have some unique passive or active abilities that allow them to buff nearby troops and act as solid support pieces while still remaining as the cheapest lord option. Finally, their mount options should be the Lamassu and Great Taurus if they follow Zatan's example, so it does give them something they can ride, which is always nice. Moving on to the heroes, there are 4 genuinely interesting options. First, we have the Demon Smith Sorcerer. So the Demon Smith Sorcerer is pretty interesting in the world of wizard heroes because they're actually notably different than the Sorcerer Prophets. The Demon Smiths almost act more as an engineer character that also has access to magic, as opposed to the typical just regular hero level wizard. So they're supposed to have kind of unique interactions with the various creations of the Chaos Dwarfs, which maybe CA could do some really interesting things there and have them like provide unique buffs, kind of like how a Packmaster can have unique buffs for Molder creatures, or a Necrotech can have unique interactions with constructs. But they're also wizards. They have access to the same lores of magic as the Sorcerer Prophet, with the exception of the lore of Hashut. So in tabletop, they only have access to the lore of fire, metal, and death. They do not have Hashut. Only the prophets can wield such power. They are also able to ride mounts. I believe they're able to take the Lamassu, the Great Taurus, and the Bale Taurus. They're not restricted to like lesser mounts. They have typical openness, which does, allow for some nice powers. And just like the Sorcerer Prophet, they have access to pretty much the same weapons. So they could be more defensive oriented. They could have like a short range pistol. They could have grenades with the little naphtha bombs, stuff like that. After that, the other actual Chaos Dwarf character is the Dark Castellan. So the Dark Castellan is essentially the Thane, you could say, of the Chaos Dwarfs. He is the mostly melee-focused hero, but once again, he's kind of a weird hybrid in that he does have access to a significant amount of shooting weapons. Because the Dark Castellan you can kind of think of him as the big boss of the Infernals, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But the Dark Castellan, although a melee-centric career, does have access to the Fire Glaive, which Fire Glaives are a very, very iconic and badass unique weapon of the Chaos Dwarfs that functions as both a halberd and a rifle. So giving him that would allow him to functionally be he would have a rifle's level of power and range, but on top of that, he would have significant armor, anti-large, armor-piercing. He'd be a pretty solid character, which could allow for some really interesting design. It'd probably make him a fair bit more expensive than your typical, like, quote-unquote cheap melee hero, compared to like a Thane or an Empire captain. But I do think it offers a lot of its own merits and could be a really, really fun character. I'm curious if maybe he could be kind of more of, I don't know. I don't know if I would want the Demon Smith Sorcerer to be more heavily on the engineering side of things, or the Dark Castellan to be more on the engineering side of things. But they could also just say screw it and do it with both of them, where they both have some kind of unique interactions, or maybe they buff different kinds of units. So your Dark Castellan is more for your actual ranged infantry as far as his engineering abilities go, and then your Demon Smith is more for your actual war machines. That could be a fun way to sort of split their role while still keeping them both viable. After that, we have not technically a Chaos Dwarf, but close, which is the Bull Centaur Talruk. And the Bull Centaur Talruk is exactly what it sounds like on the 10. He is the big bad of the Bull Centaurs. So you have your regular Bull Centaurs, and then the tier above that, the captain of Hashut's personal guard, his temple guardians, is the Talruk, who's just an absolute monster. It is a terrifying, it's a Bull Centaur that's a bit larger than the others. It's still not massive, but it's good sized. It would basically be like having a hero level dragon ogre. So not a Shaggoth per se, but something between the two. In any event, he should just once again be a big beat stick. I would probably, if you have the Dark Castellan running around with anti-large thanks to his fire glaive, maybe with the Bull Centaur you go anti-infantry. So maybe he runs you can either, I would say probably either a great weapon or a axe and shield combo. That way, if you do the axe and shield combo, it helps him be tankier, which he would easily have the largest health pool of the heroes, maybe with the exception of the Demon Smith riding on mounts, which the Dark Castellan also was an infantry only character. Just to get that out real quick, I suppose it could ride on a mount, but in his updated rules, which we have in 8th edition, he was pure infantry, which I think is fine, especially for engineer focused characters that have like long range guns, because they're useful even at a good distance. But back to the Taruk, I think that I think I would go shield with him, but I could definitely see the argument for great weapon. If you go great weapon, you probably could get away with a higher melee attack, bigger focus on offense, and just tons and tons of armor piercing damage. But at the same time, because he's a kind of a big monstrous infantry, monstrous cavalry, I guess technically he'd be infantry. He would be able, I think he would technically be monstrous cavalry. It doesn't matter. He would still be able to get away with armor piercing even with a single hand weapon and a shield. But the shield would obviously provide him a lot more survivability, especially when being shot at, as well as increasing his, melee defense and armor and everything. And these guys should be beefy. They're big boys. So that would basically be the Taruk. He'd probably be your guy that focuses a lot on being able to like assault units and assault garrisons and things like that, but would also be excellent in your armies. And they are noted as being like temple guardians, and they often act as the bodyguards for the sorcerer prophets and other like important representatives of Hashut. So I could easily see them having the guardian ability, and that sort of like the Bretonnian paladin, which would add like another layer of what they can do. So not only are they incredibly dangerous in combat and have lots of health and are fairly fast compared to most Chaos Dwarf characters, at least until the demons or the heroes, until the others get mounts, but they also can be like a nice bodyguard for your other characters. So that's it for the Taruk. Obviously doesn't have any mounts because it functionally is a mount. The last one is the Hobgoblin Khan. So just kind of like we talked with Gordas a little bit ago, the Hobgoblin Khan is it's your goblin big boss, essentially. It's your sneaky little bastard assassin character with poisoned attacks. These are the worst of the worst among the hobgoblins who have managed to rise up among the ranks, and although they're not trusted by the Chaos Dwarves, they're at least allowed to lead their other brethren and kind of keep them in line and keep them organized. So it could be really fun to have a kind of expendable hero, or a hero that it would be. I always love the expendable trait, and having an expendable character could be really interesting and funny in a lot of ways. But maybe he's able to have unique interactions with the hobgoblins where he can make them more effective. Hobgoblins have a really big thing in their tabletop rules about whenever they strike someone from an unexpected angle, so they get like a rear charge or a flank charge, they get quite a few significant bonuses. So I would really like to see the hobgoblin units get the devastating charge rule, or devastating flanker, I think is what it's actually called. That Slanesh ability, where if you hit someone in the flank or the rear, you get like double charge bonus or whatever. I think that would be perfect on hobgoblins. Just really reward them for getting around behind you. But just like Gore does, should be able to ride a giant wolf. As far as his equipment goes, I'd probably just go like a sword and shield, or like a little scimitar and shield. Maybe you could get away with giving him a bow, but I feel like there's already so much kind of shooting between the potential of the Demon Smith and the Dark Castellan that having the Hobgoblin also have a bow almost kind of feels like overkill to me, but I could definitely see the argument for it. Personally, I'd probably just go like a little sickle and shield, and you keep the character as cheap as possible, because I honestly think one of the big flaws of the Chaos Dwarves is a lot of their units are going to be very expensive and like not high motto count, which is why you're going to be relying on some really, really crappy units to give you numbers. But that is going to wrap up all the potential heroes. So now let's move on to the infantry. So the first and foremost infantry unit that I'm expecting are Chaos Dwarf Warriors. So it's just like Dwarf Warriors, but they're Chaos Dwarf Warriors. And they are reliable. They're heavily armored. Well, as heavily armored as kind of a core unit can be, but they come with a good assortment of options. There we go. So I think you'll have Chaos Dwarf Warriors with Axe and Shield, which, decent melee defense, missile block chance, all the goodies. You'll have Chaos Dwarf Warriors with great weapons, just like you do with Dwarfs, where you trade out that melee defense and shield for the armor piercing and kind of more reliable damage. And then you're going to have the Blunderbuss. So the Blunderbuss is where regular dwarfs have rifles or crossbows with their Quarrelers and Thunderers. Chaos Dwarfs just have the Blunderbuss for their basic units, at least back in 5th edition. And the Blunderbuss is exactly what it sounds like. They're these terrifying big-barreled guns that they're shotguns on steroids. So these should be the best version of those. There are a decent number of kind of shotgun-like things that we've seen appear in Total War Warhammer with like the Iron Hail Gunners and the I forget what they're called, but the Vampire Coast guys. The Chaos Dwarf one should be the creme de la creme. They should be the absolute best shotgun infantry unit in the game, because that is like the classic terrifying thing that the Chaos Dwarfs would bring to the table. Would be a lot of blunderbusses that if they managed to get them close enough to you and unleash a volley, it was just game over. It would shred through armor and absolutely obliterate whatever poor son of a bitch was caught in front of it. So I would really like to see the blunderbuss unit of Chaos Dwarf Warriors be quite strong. Now, there is one additional potential option, though it's only kind of vaguely ever talked about, and I've never been able to find a true tabletop profile for it, but it also might be lost. It might be hidden in a White Dwarf somewhere. There has been mentions in the lore about essentially Chaos Dwarf rocket launchers. So kind of like a Death Shrieker rocket, but not as large. And, they're kind of like just little shoulder-mounted rocket cannons that would shoot out these little missiles and, explode into a unit. I think that could be very, very cool, kind of having a longer range infantry unit. I don't know if that would be too effective for the basic warriors. It might need to be upgraded to one of the more elite infantry units instead of being allowed on the basic warrior unit. But I suppose if you made them inaccurate enough and they like barely did any armor piercing damage, it was more about just like explosion and fire damage, I think that would be fair. But I don't know. The rocket launchers are definitely, I think, in the more hazy zone of side of things. But the shield, great weapon, and blunderbuss, I think, are absolutely 100% going to be in. Rocket launchers, I would love to see, but it'd be a little tricky, I think, to implement them without having to put them on a higher tier unit. Moving on, the next core unit that we have, or infantry, I should say, is the Hobgoblin Cutthroats. So Hobgoblin Cutthroats are your basic tier infantry for the Chaos Dwarfs. There are significantly more of them. They're cheaper, but they will have the expendable rule more than likely. No, they will definitely have the expendable rule, and they are not nearly as reliable as your other units, so they do bring the numbers. There should be, I think, 3 variants of these. So you should have your basic variants, which are like the sickle swords and shields, which are just sword and board. Then you can have your dual weapons. So you get the dual wielding lads, and then you have your archers, and that's pretty standard affair for kind of that type of infantry. So hobgoblins, hooray! Once again, I would give them all some kind of benefit if they're attacking you from the back or the side, at least for their melee attacks. So maybe devastating flanker or something along those lines. Then we have 2 more basic infantry units, which are the Orc Slaves and the Goblin Slaves. So these, unfortunately, weren't in the Tarmacon book because the Tarmacon book was focused on a very specific type of elite force. But in the old 5th edition book, there were a number of slave units that the Chaos Dwarfs could bring to the battlefield. And Chaos Dwarfs have tons and tons and tons of Goblin and Orc slaves. It is by far the most numerous type of slave they have because greenskins are hardy and there's also just infinite numbers of them, especially in the Darklands. So I would love to see these units show up on the battlefield and just be trash. Like there are a lot, like your Goblin slaves, there's a ton of them, but they should be even worse than regular goblins from the greenskins. Because the regular goblins from the greenskins should at least get like, they've got at least their shields and spears or whatever, and they've got like, even if their armor sucks, they kind of wear armor, and they're there of their own choice, generally speaking, the goblin slaves should just be sad. Like, they should be down there kind of like with Skaven slaves, but maybe even worse, because they're like, it should just be awful. They should be just the worst unit there is, but they are dirt cheap, and there's a ton of them to just, so kind of like a zombie unit that can panic and flee. But you know, Skaven slaves, they're like Skaven slaves. Orc slaves, very similar principle. There should be quite a few of them. Not very good, not very strong, very easy to kill, but they just block you. There's just a lot of them, so it's a lot of health, and it's just a tar pit that once it breaks and its leadership is gone, it's basically useless, but it has the expendable trait, so the Chaos Dwarfs don't actually care. It's just there to buy time. Now, in the 5th edition Chaos Dwarf book, you could have Black Orc slaves. However, they should not be allowed. I am so against that. That would be the ultimate, like, boo moment from a lore standpoint of having Black Orc slaves. You should not be able to have them. Period. End of story. The only way you should be able to get Black Orcs as Chaos Dwarfs is if you buddy up with Greenskins and you hire, like, Black Orc allied units. But the Black Orcs have been completely run out of Zarnagrund. The Chaos Dwarfs have made it crystal clear in their lore that they will never rely on them again. They completely exiled them, and if anything, did their best to wipe them out because they realized how dangerous they were, and that they cannot be allowed ever within any of the Chaos Dwarf sites, because it's very likely that it will lead to a rebellion. I would be personally very, very disappointed to see Black Orc slaves, and I hope they don't do that. Moving on to the next category, we have regular cavalry, or basic cavalry, and there's only one unit here, which are Hobgoblin Wolf Riders. Now, the thing about the Hobgoblin Wolf Riders, there's only 2 variants, essentially. I am expecting there should be an Archer variant and your Spear variant. So just like regular Goblin Wolf Riders, but Hobgoblin Wolf Riders should be notably better. The Hobgoblins are kind of like a tier above regular Goblins. So like where you have your Orc slaves and your Goblin slaves, Hobgoblin Cutthroats I expect to be above Goblins, but maybe not better than like good Orcs. But for the Hobgoblin Wolf Riders, Archer Spears, and I hope they look different, because one of the really big notes in the Chaos Dwarf lore is that the Hobgoblin Wolf Riders are not the same types of Hobgoblins that the Cutthroats are. The Hobgoblin Cutthroats are actual slaves. Like they're the favored slaves, like they're the favored toy or favored pet, but they are still part of Chaos Dwarf culture. They still work for the Chaos Dwarfs, slave for the Chaos Dwarfs, and they are their little minions. The Hobgoblin Wolf Riders are very specifically not a servant of the Chaos Dwarfs in a traditional sense. They are mercenaries. They are actual hobgoblins from the actual Hobgoblin Khanate in the Eastern Steppes that have wandered down to the Darklands and been hired as scouts and soldiers by the Chaos Dwarfs. They're still expendable because the Chaos Dwarfs don't trust anything that's not a Chaos Dwarf. And but because of that, they should hopefully have a unique design, and they also have access to essentially a unique rule, which is that in tabletop, the Hobgoblin Wolf Riders, if they're pursuing a unit that is already fleeing or broken, they get quite a few bonuses to like catch it and run it down. So it would be really cool to see them get an ability that if they're pursuing like a fleeing unit, maybe they get a speed bonus or a charge bonus. But I would love for them to just be, they should be like a really, really good unit if you're using them to make sure that enemy units that have broken stay broken and either flee off the table or become shattered. That ends cavalry. So now we are on to elite infantry. So first and foremost, definitely coming to the game, I would be eating my shoes if they weren't in the game, are the Infernal Guard. Now, there are 3 variants of Infernal Guard, but there's also a couple of little things to talk about at the end, which is that for the Infernal Guard, there's the classic version, which is the Fireglaves. So Fireglaive Infernal, which the Infernal Guard are the super elite specialty unit, we'll say, of the Black Fortress. So Drassoat the Ashen has a ton of these guys, but theoretically they could show up anywhere. From a cultural perspective, they're actually very similar to Slayers. They are Chaos Dwarfs who have failed or been shamed in some notable way. And so basically they were treated as quote unquote dead, and their faces are sealed behind a mask that's like heated up so that it practically like binds to their flesh or melts their flesh to it. and they stay behind that mask, essentially not having an identity until they eventually prove themselves worthy somehow. And should they survive the rigorous trials of being an Infernal Guard and climbing the ranks and being essentially promoted or freed from that bond, they tear the mask off and are able to embrace freedom, able to start a new life and are no longer shamed. They can earn redemption. That's essentially what the Dark Castellans are. The Dark Castellans tend to be individuals among the Infernals who have freed themselves from that pact. So they have really messed up looking faces because they've torn their masks off. But in any event, back to the Infernal Guard. So you have the Fireglaves, which are halberds and also rifles, which is going to be a really, really powerful unit. That is a nasty combo. A unit that has excellent guns, but also has charge defense against large and anti-large, and is also super heavily armored. Like, Infernal Guard are very, very heavily armored. They are not messing around. They have that black shard armor, which is equivalent. It's more on par with like chaos armor. So these are not like Streltsy, where they pack a punch, but like their defense is a little lacking. Nah, these guys are tough. So you have your Fireglaves, which is the halberd / range variant. There's also great weapons, so you can have them with great weapons if you just want to go pure armor piercing, and really, really high damage output. And then they should also have a shielded variant where you go shield and axe, where you're just going pure defense, pure trying to stay in place. That being said, in tabletop they did have access. I believe their unit champion could take pistols or naphtha bombs. So I kind of expect these guys to have naphtha bombs, because naphtha bombs, like I said, they're just grenades. So they would basically be the equivalent of iron breakers. Now, I don't think it would make sense for the Fireglaive variant to have naphtha bombs, but maybe the shield variant and the great weapon variant could have naphtha bombs. So they have a little bit of a shooting attack. They kind of have that ability to shoot at the foe before they charge in. But a part of me also thinks that maybe it should just be the shielded variant that has it, because like when you're dealing with great weapons, typically you're a unit that wants to get the charge. You want to be like swinging as you're going in, not sitting in place. And it's also like, a big two-handed weapon. So I kind of feel like if you have like the pistols making an appearance in the roster on the Sorcerer Prophet and maybe the Demon Smith, and you've got Fireglaves as a variant and also on the Dark Castellan, then maybe you have the Naphtha Bomb make its appearance on the Infernal Guard shield variant. So, they have the ability to like throw explode grenades or whatever they'd throw, just like dwarf miners or dwarf iron breakers, because they'd be kind of cool. I mean, they could have pistols, but I feel like pistols wouldn't work quite as well. But that's just my opinion, especially because there's already like a long range rifle version of the unit. The next unit up would be the Infernal Ironsworn. So Infernal Ironsworn are beefy. They are the absolute top of the Infernals. So if the Infernal Guard are like fairly elite-ish Chaos Warriors, the Infernal Ironsworn are your chosen. There's only one variant of them, though. In tabletop, or in Tarmacon, if you took a unit of Infernal Ironsworn, they're very expensive, and they're insanely tanky. They have super duper high armor, extremely good stats, and they will hold the line for eternity. But they only come with axe and shield. However, they do have magic damage. So they deal magical damage in addition to anything else that they do, which magic damage absolutely has its place in Total War Warhammer. I think having magic damage is never a bad thing because there's no protection against it, and it allows you to get around physical resistance, which is super nice. So Infernal Ironsworn are just going to be they're basically chosen with hand, weapon, and shield, except for they might have a better stat line or a very similar stat line, but they also get magic damage on top of it. Moving on to another unit that I really, really, really want to see, but I don't expect to see them, but I would love to see them, are the Harridans. So Harridans only exist within the Wulfric novel. That's the only time they've made an appearance. And Harridans are female chaos dwarfs who have basically past the age of being able to have kids. So because of that, Chaos Dwarf Society is very patriarchal, as most dwarf society is, And but unlike regular dwarfs who still place a lot of value on Wrens and they like have queens and all this stuff, the Chaos Dwarf Society takes a purely like almost like capitalist perspective where it's like, oh, okay, they no longer have the ability to be part of society's production, therefore their value has significantly decreased. So what Harridans are used for when they appear in the Wulfric novel is they're basically an elite bodyguard unit that serve the sorcerer prophets. And they are older women chaos dwarfs who wield great weapons. If I recall correctly, I believe they wield like these big two-handed like mauls or axes or something. But they wield great weapons and they barely wear armor. I think they only have like a leather breastplate or something like that. But they basically wear robes and just a little bit of armor, like just kind of a chest piece, and they're just fanatical murderers. Like they are, like they went toe to toe with Wulfric's very, very strong personal buddies, and were massacring a lot of those lads. They do not mess around. So I would love to see the Harridans as an all-female unit of elderly Chaos Dwarf women who have the Unbreakable trait, the Guardian ability, passive, and they're slayers. So you just if they get thrown into combat, they don't give a damn about defense. They have very little melee defense. They have very little armor. They don't really have anything keeping them. They have more armor than slayers, but they don't have the whirling axes to give them like missile resistance or anything. But they are unbreakable. They do have Guardian, and they will absolutely like tear people apart with those high melee attack, armor piercing attacks. I think it can make for a really interesting and unique unit that would just be really fun to watch in action. And then the last elite infantry unit are the Immortals. You could, I guess, call them like death masks, but I think Immortals sounds cooler because we know that, so in the lore, we know that Grimgor Ironhide stole the idea of Da Immortals from the Chaos Dwarfs. He had some kind of encounter in Zarnagrund with a elite group, or he either saw them or fought them, or we don't know what happened. But Grimgor has encountered a group known as the Immortals in Chaos Dwarf Society, who are apparently like just the absolute most badasses that exist. Period. There is nothing more dangerous than them among the Chaos Dwarfs. And I think they might also appear in the Wulfric novel, though I'm not 100% sure. I know there is kind of an elite bodyguard unit that shows up, and I think it's the Immortals. As far as like what weapons they wield, they've never had a true tabletop profile, so they could wield anything. Maybe they could wield dual weapons. There's not a lot of those among the actual Chaos Dwarf units, so maybe you could have them wielding like dual axes. They could wield halberds. You could have more axe and shield, though I feel like the Infernal Ironsworn kind of have the axe and shield eliteness covered, and the Harridans kind of feel like a good great weapon unit. So I would probably go either dual weapons or halberds, is my thinking. The Fireglaves are really nice halberds, but they're also a shooting unit, and they're also not like top of the top elite infantry. They're more like Chaos Dwarf mid infantry. So maybe the Immortals could be your absolute elite halberd unit that aren't Fireglaves, so they're able to just spec purely into combat. But let me know what y'all think. Like, what do y'all think would be good for the Immortals? The only thing I feel confident about is that they should have the best stats next to maybe the Infernal Ironsworn. Maybe the Immortals are focused more on attacking, less on defense. Or, they're kind of the halfway point. If your Harridans are your pure offense, your Ironsworn are your pure defense, then your Immortals are a nice, healthy balance of the two. But they should have, really good stats, insane leadership, insane melee attack, melee defense, all that jazz. So let me know what y'all think. Moving on to the next category, we have Monstrous Infantry. There's only one Monstrous Infantry unit, technically, depending on how you rate Bull Centaurs, which I'm going to put them in the cavalry section, but it's the Kadai Fireborn. So the Kadai are easily the thing I'm the most excited for in the Chaos Dwarf roster. Kadai they look like fire elementals. They're not true fire elementals because we actually have those in Warhammer Fantasy, but they are a form of life that the Chaos Dwarfs created. They are manufactured life forms, which is terrifying. But basically, they are these nightmarish creatures that are created from a mix of horrifying sorcery, demon stuff, like demon essence and magic. I think I already said sorcery. And fire, kind of like Hashit's power. And they look like inert suits of armor, and then when they show up on the battlefield, the Chaos Dwarfs activate them, and they emerge from their armor as these terrifying fire creatures that start wreaking havoc across the battlefield. And they are very, very difficult to kill because anything that is not made of magic struggles to hurt them. So just like demons, I personally, I would probably just treat them like demons. So give them like demonic instability, so they're unbreakable. But if their leadership gets too low, they start to fall apart, or something like that. They had a very peculiar rule in tabletop where they were basically unstoppable, but every turn you had to roll a check to represent them burning themselves out, because they burned so hot that they would literally melt through the runes animating them, and they would essentially kill themselves. It was like a built-in self-destruct device that was guaranteed to go off. So I don't know how that would work in Total War. Like, you wouldn't want a unit that like slowly takes damage over the course of the fight, because your opponent could just avoid you the entire time. So that would suck. But I'm really not sure how you'd represent that other than just kind of giving them regular demonic instability. But they should have the burning body rule, where they should have good physical resistance, probably decent armor, and be very, very devastating, magical flaming attacks. Also should have melee damage reflection. So, when they're fighting in combat, they reflect melee damage back at you because they're on fire. So fighting them is really difficult. They should be reasonably fast, easily, definitely up there with other Monstrous Infantry, from your Kroxigors to your Minotaurs and all that other stuff. And they should just be absolute powerhouses. Very little mind on defense, extremely high leadership, and their goal is just to go in and wreck shop until they eventually fall apart and die. And I hope they're beautifully animated. Moving on to the Monstrous Cavalry, we have only one unit in this category as well, which are the Bull Centaur Renders. So Bull Centaur Renders are just the Bull Centaur unit. They're the only... That's it. However, there should be 3 variants of them. They're basically just like Dragon Ogres, though hopefully they don't get screwed over like Dragon Ogres, in that there should be a shielded variant, a dual weapon variant, and a great weapon variant. I expect they'll follow kind of the formula that we have for these units, which is that the shielded version is the tankiest. It's got missile resistance, higher melee defense, and a little bit better armor, but does still have armor piercing attacks. Then you have dual weapons, which give you the anti-infantry bonus and are very focused on cutting through like large swaths of infantry. And then your great weapon variant, which gets the anti-large bonus and is better at dealing with cavalry and other monsters. Pretty standard, should have very high charge bonus, be super cool looking, probably more heavily armored than most other units of their kind. So like comparing them against Minotaurs or Dragon Ogres, I would expect Bull Centaur Renders to be the most heavily armored, but maybe they're a little slower than their other counterparts, and maybe there's less of them, but they have better defenses overall. Then we're on to the monsters, which there's quite a few here. So first and foremost, we have the model that I'm the most excited to see because it doesn't have an official model. So Creative Assembly has a lot of freedom to create something like truly spectacular, which is the Kadai Destroyer. The Kadai Destroyer could show up in any number of forms, but it's basically a Kadai Fireborn, but instead of being one of a group of 10 or 12 or 16 or whatever, it's just one giant, horrifying, flaming demon monster. It should be like, the Balrog from Lord of the Rings if it was also a mechanical nightmare creature. So I'm really curious to see how they're going to make it. It had a bunch of optional rules in tabletop. It had the ability to fly. It had the ability to have like spikes on it that would cut people up that got too close to it. It could be designed to be more like a giant charging animal, or more like a giant winged demon, or more like just kind of a large dwarf or chaos dwarf, or like a representation of what Hashit might actually look like. Like they really could cut wild with it. I just hope it's an absolute beat stick. Should have lots and lots of defenses. Should have the same kind of rule as the Fireborn, where it's got lots of physical resistance, melee damage reflection, flaming magical attacks, demonic instability, and all that other stuff. So it should basically be your greater demon if you're playing as the Chaos Dwarfs, like the unit that you're super excited to get because you know it's just going to curb stomp everything. Next is, of course, the Giant, but the Chaos Dwarfs actually very uniquely have a very different Giant than any other faction. All of the other factions that have a Giant, it's a regular Giant. It's just Chaos Giant, Beastman Giant, Slave Giant for the Ogres, and then Giant for the Greenskins. They're just it's the same thing. The Chaos Dwarf Giant, however, is the Chaos Siege Giant. And it's very different because the Chaos Dwarfs have quote unquote augmented it by horribly torturing it. And basically the augments are that they cover it head to toe in armor that's nailed into its flesh. So it's very, very tanky. It has tons and tons of armor. And they also tend to chop off their hands and replace their hands with like giant hook blades that allow the giants to not only, carve people up in melee, but also allow them to attack walls directly. So they run up to walls, and their augmented limbs are better designed for like slamming into the wall and pulling out chunks of it. So they should definitely have the wall breaker ability. And it would be I love to see them because I'm really curious how their animations would look, and hopefully they'd be like really kind of gross and sad. And they should also very, very much be something beloved by Giant fans, because it'd be like, finally a Giant that has like tons of armor, which would be really fun and unique. Though I imagine you'd probably have to make some like stat adjustments. Like they should be definitely slower than other Giants, which is kind of hard to imagine in some ways. Like Giants are reasonably fast, but they're not super fast. They definitely take their time, and this guy should be weighted down by all that armor. But anyway, moving on to the flying monsters. Thanks to the Monstrous Arcanum and also like some Tarmacon stuff, you were able to take these monsters on their own. So I don't see why Creative Assembly would not allow us to have these monsters as, individual units. First up is the Lamassu. The Lamassu is a very weird monster. I'm curious to see what it's going to look like, because all of the art and especially minis that we have of the Lamassu don't look great, because it's basically a giant manticore-like creature. If the manticore's head was that of a Chaos Dwarf instead of, like a big kitty cat or whatever. So it's a very bizarre looking creature because it's like purple and it has a giant dwarf head with like a red beard. However, they are very sinister creatures, because unlike most monsters, they are so heavily infused with magic that they literally breathe magic and kind of like almost consume it. So they're able to be wizards. They can cast spells, though because the fact that it's a monster and not an actual wizard and you can take it as a mount, I suspect it'll just be bound spells, because I think that just works a lot better. I don't really like when regular units can cast spells. It's never worth it in my opinion. So I would love to see it have bound spells from the, I think it could take the lore of Shadow. I'm pretty sure. So, maybe, you get 1 or 2 bound spells from the lore of Shadow. And then it should have, if they really wanted to go the extra mile, it does have an aura in tabletop where it negates magic damage. I don't know how that would necessarily work. Maybe it could apply, like the closest thing I can think of is the immune to contact effect aura. So maybe it could have the aura of immune to contact effect, but it's like very small, like, 20 meters or 15 meters or something, because that's a very powerful ability. But that would be really cool, if it kind of flies over a unit and you're able to protect it from a lot of things. If it's like, oh, I've got this character with a lot of physical resistance, I could fly Lamassu over it with the no contact aura and negate. I think that works for attack types. So like, I know it works for poison, but I think that works for like fire and magic as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Someone would have to correct me. But the Lamassu is also the worst of the fighters among the Chaos Dwarf monsters. It has super high magic resistance. It flies, so it's pretty maneuverable. It has bound spells, which is like a really fun, unique gimmick, and it should have some kind of fun aura for its magic eating ability, but it's not a very good fighter. It's more of a manipulator from a lore standpoint. So it should definitely be the worst at fighting. Then you have the Great Taurus. The Great Taurus is a giant flying pissed off bull monster that is kind of on par with like a sun dragon, maybe a little higher damage, but at the cost of less armor and defense. However, it is like, because it's a big blazing bull creature. It does have the burning body ability. So it should, if burning body is represented the way it should be, you know, it should have some physical resistance, and it should have melee damage reflection, because that's literally what burning body does. Would love to see that, because I think anytime you can have a big monster you can throw down into a slam down into a unit and then it has melee damage reflection is really cool. Fire attacks, should be pretty nasty, like very good charge, very aggressive, but should probably come at so it's kind of like their interpretation of the Manticore. Then you have the Bale Taurus. So the Bale Taurus is significantly scarier than the Great Taurus. Not only does it have a notably better stat line, but they can actually breathe fire. So it should basically be the Chaos Dwarf equivalent of a dragon. So if the Great Taurus is the Chaos Dwarf's Manticore, the Bale Taurus is the Chaos Dwarf's dragon. It should have a breath attack that, it will be really good for shooting down units. And then it should have a really nasty stat line, the blazing body, so the physical resist and the melee damage reflection, cause that, all three of these guys cause terror. And then they fly, so they should be very, very fast on the battlefield. And I would say the Bale Taurus should be absolutely able to go toe-to-toe with other big monsters and really go to town on them and deal a lot of damage. Great Taurus should probably be more for isolating out maybe elite cavalry units or elite infantry or isolated characters. Then you have the maybe. So there is technically a creature that exists in the Chaos Dwarf lore, though it has not been mentioned in quite some time, which is, it's called the Colossus, but you could also refer to it probably as the Demon Colossus or something along those lines. But basically what the Colossus is it only shows up in a few little stories, but the Colossus typically is described as a large construct, so a large mechanical thing that has been through demon smithing, so it's got demons trapped within it, and it's this giant moving mechanical construct that in one story I've read, it's described just kind of as a large moving platform that's almost spider-like, so it has giant legs that can stomp and crush people and sweep them aside, and as it moves around, but it also has a platform on top where there's a bunch of Chaos Dwarfs shooting weapons down at people below. So kind of imagine it, I guess, is the Chaos Dwarf's answer to the Chaos War Mammoth, where it's just or the Dread Saurian, or maybe a little smaller Dread Saurian, more like a Stegodon, where it's a big, scary, heavily armored monster creature that also has a bunch of people on top that are shooting weapons. I honestly think it would be perfectly viable to have a large mecha spider monstrosity that, it's because it's made of metal, it's very heavily armored, and it's got a demon in it, so it's got magical attacks and all this stuff, but it's also got, a good handful of maybe Infernal Guard on top of it who have fire glaives, so they're shooting people with rifles as it's walking around the battlefield and curb stomping people. But like I said, it hasn't appeared in a very long time, and I feel like the Colossus has kind of been replaced by the Kadai Destroyer and the Iron Demon, but it has existed, so I could see it appearing. Then we're on to the final category, which are war machines. So the first war machine is by far the most simple, which is the Hobgoblin Bolt Thrower. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a crappy wooden bolt thrower that the Hobgoblins make, but they can build them fairly easily and frequently, and it shoots a single large bolt that is good for skewering multiple people. Probably should have the anti-large bonus, so it's better at skewering cavalry and monsters. Good armor piercing. To be fairly, probably not very accurate, not very good range, because it is built by Hobgoblins. However, since we haven't gotten the Goblin Spear Chukka, which is the exact same thing but built by regular goblins in the Greenskin roster, I would love to see the Hobgoblin Bolt Thrower and then them also give us the Goblin Spear Chukka at the same time as free LC. That would be great. But I also kind of am expecting not to see it because we haven't gotten the Spear Chukka yet. But who knows? Then we have the Death Shrieker Rocket Battery, which the Death Shrieker Rocket Battery should just be the Hellstorm Rocket Battery, but on steroids. Because the Chaos Dwarfs have a much more devastating version. It would be more expensive, but more terrifying. So it shoots out nasty rockets that shriek as they come through the air, and they come down on the ground. They have big explosions. So very large AoE explosions Probably not the most armor piercing, but should deal like significant leadership damage, and it should be really, really good against like Skaven, Greenskins, Vampire Counts, and other like horde armies, where you should be able to just like fire off volleys and they just kind of land across the battlefield and blow up lots and lots of infantry. Then you have the Magma Cannon, which is the Chaos Dwarf's answer to the Flame Cannon of the Dwarfs. But the Magma Cannon, instead of shooting goblets of flame, literally shoots giant, just like loogies of magma, and it's awful. It's literally just a better flame cannon. So probably significantly more damage, but maybe it takes longer to fire. Maybe it has like less range or some other penalty to kind of trade off. Maybe it's just more expensive, but it's literally just a flame cannon, but way better. So you have that. Then you have the Hell Cannon. So obviously the Hell Cannon is crewed by Chaos Dwarfs, and it's actually, it was the first Chaos Dwarf unit in the game. So the Hell Cannon should absolutely make a return and be available to the Chaos Dwarfs, though I hope they fix it. The Hell Cannon we have in Total War Warhammer is actually not a real Hell Cannon in my opinion, because it cannot defend itself in melee, which is dumb. Hell Cannons, they're one of their whole most important big things is that Hell Cannons are basically slightly, just teeny tiny bit below Greater Demon level in close combat. They're supposed to be monstrous entities fighting in combat, like spinning around, like running over people with their wheels, or like the cannon barrel coming down and shooting point blank, or chomping people with the big mouth, or chain should like whip out around it and like slice through people. But I don't care how they animate it, but it should absolutely be defending itself in close combat, because that's why you're only, supposed to get one, and they're so expensive, and they're also it's just a major aspect of it as a entity is that it's supposed to be very deadly in combat. And since we have, Cygors and Bastillodons and bone giants with, arrows, like we have plenty of monsters in the game that are also capable of shooting. So there's no reason why the Hell Cannon should not be upgraded to sit along his brethren, in my opinion. So the Hell Cannon needs to be made into a proper Hell Cannon. Then you have the Dreadquake Mortar. The Dreadquake Mortar is supposed to be the deadliest of the Chaos Dwarf shooting weapons. It's supposed to be the most terrifying. The ammunition for it is literally so dense and large that it takes an ogre to load it. So hopefully it'll have an ogre crew member. And basically what it is it's just a giant mortar. So I kind of expect it to be on par with Queen Bess, but instead of it shooting, a bunch of barrels that hit the ground, explode, and like deal a lot of damage in that area, it should instead fire like these terrifying mortar shells that glow or like really look ominous, and then when they hit the ground they should deal a ton of damage. And they should also have like I would imagine that they would have like kind of two AoEs. So you'd have like the initial impact area AoE where it just deals a lot of damage to enemies, and then there should be a much wider AoE where it provides a temporary debuff and lowers speed significantly. So kind of like it should basically give you the suppression effect, but it should be a very large AoE on the suppression effect, to the point that it should be genuinely difficult for human players to dodge the speed debuff, even if they're paying attention, unless it's like a fast cavalry unit, or they like immediately change direction because they know who's being shot at. Then the last entity, though it's technically two different units because I imagine they're based on how they tend to do things, is the Iron Demon. The Iron Demon is probably the unit that I think most people are excited for, or at least many people are excited for. It is the Thomas the Demon Train, the Nightmare Train. It's literally a giant demonic train engine that has a demon inside of it, crewed by Chaos Dwarfs, and it drags across the battlefield, shooting at people through these little guns it has on the front, as well as the crew atop it, and it can ram into people and run them over and grind their guts and their bones beneath its wheels, and it should chug across the battlefield. And the Skull Cracker should just be the significantly better version, where the Iron Demon is a cheaper version that we'll talk about what its main function is in a second. It can go into melee and it will hurt. The Skullcracker is designed for melee. And the Skullcracker is literally that they said, well, we have a train. We might as well put a terrifying, like, series of machines or something on the front of it that makes it absolutely devastate anything it runs into. So it's like a battering ram that moves like, 60 miles an hour and weighs like thousands of pounds or whatever. So this thing comes hurtling towards you, and I don't care what you are, this thing should mess your ass up on the charge. The Skullcracker, I don't know what a Skullcracker is going to look like. We don't have any official artwork for it. Based on the description, it's like there's like some sort of runically empowered demonic thing put on the front, like a hammer or I don't know. It's not really clear what it's supposed to be, but there's some kind of augmentation put on the front of the train that makes it that when the train rams into something, the effect is just absolutely devastating. So that should be kind of the quote unquote melee variant. And then you have the Iron Demon, which, although will be very cool on its own, I'm really curious to see how it's going to work, because one of the big things the Iron Demon could do, other than the fact that it's unbreakable, extremely heavily armored, very tanky, reasonably fast. So like it's so fucking difficult to get rid of. These things are like steam tanks, but deadlier. Is that the Iron Demon is supposed to be able to pull carriages, and the carriages are supposed to be other war machines. So it would be like if you took an Iron Demon, you could attach like a Deathstreaker rocket to it, or you could attach a magma cannon to it, or I think a Dreadquake mortar. But there were certain types of war machines you could attach onto it, and it would basically be able to drag them around the battlefield and like redeploy them. I have no idea how that would work in this game. The only thing I can think of is that maybe it could give you like, I don't know. Like maybe it could have like a bounce spell based on what the machine that like it's associated with. So like maybe you get an Iron Demon and you can take an Iron Demon that's supposed to be dropping off a rocket battery, but it gives you a bound spell so that it like at any point you can click on the bound spell and it fires a volley of Deathstreaker rocket battery shots like right where it is. And same thing for like the magma cannon and the Dreadquake mortar. That could be pretty cool. And if it was, I mean, even if it was like once per battle, that could still be a relatively powerful effect, to just have like a guaranteed bombardment and just try and time it right. If you wanted to get really crazy, maybe it could be like on a cooldown. But I would love to hear y'all's ideas about how to make the Iron Demon work, other than it just being like a scary train. Because I definitely want it to be able to like choo-choo around the battlefield and tear people up in melee, but it should also be like intimidating in other ways too. Because if it's only going to be kind of choo-chooing around in melee, it might struggle a bit. Because the Iron Demon does not have like a cannon on it like the steam tank does. It doesn't have like a fairly dangerous long range weapon. It's definitely intended to either be charging people in combat and messing them up, or be dragging around war machines that are significantly longer range. So I don't know about that one, but yeah, that's gonna be it. So that is everything I could think of that I think has even the most reasonable or unreasonable chance of showing up in the Chaos Dwarf roster. I would not be shocked for there to be some people in the comments who show up and they go, well, what about this character or this very, very specific unit? Someone's going to show up and ask about the Demon Ass Cannon. I know it now. But those are the units that I genuinely think have an opportunity to show up in the game, but I do not think all of them will make it. I mean, it's a pretty hefty roster for the Chaos Dwarfs, and it's notably larger than anything they've ever had. But I would love to know what y'all think. In any event, that is going to be the end of this video. I will be checking out y'all's comments down below for your thoughts about anything that is particularly exciting, or if there's anything you're like, oh god, I really hope that makes it, or no, that's stupid, I don't think that should be in there. Do let me know. And I will catch you guys next time. Thanks so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. See ya.